We are just getting started in a brand new summer series called New in 90. And so you picked a great day to be here, a great day to tune in. What we are doing for the next 3 months is we're going to be reading and working our way through the entire New Testament together as a church. All 27 documents and letters. We're going to cover them all over the course of the next 13 weeks. And the goal is for you and I, regardless of where we are spiritually, the goal is that by the end of this, we will have a more complete and a more holistic understanding of what this thing called Christianity actually is. And so whether you are skeptical and maybe exploring faith, hopefully as you read through the New Testament yourself, you choose to follow along. Hopefully it'll bring us to a point of decision where, you know what, we're going to either reject or accept the offer that God has for us through Jesus. If you're here online and you're relatively new to faith, maybe the first couple years of, hey, I put my trust in Jesus, what now? Well, as we work through the New Testament, you'll be able to learn and see and know exactly what it looks like and how it's meant to be to live in a relationship with God and to live out our faith as a Christian. And I would say even this, for those of us here that have been in a relationship with God for decades, and maybe you've even read through the New Testament several times before, you're familiar with reading the Bible, but hopefully this kind of different, large-scale approach, instead of focusing on one verse or one chapter at a time, hopefully this bigger perspective, God might use it to correct us and reshape us and redirect some beliefs and things that maybe we've picked up along the way that, I don't know, maybe aren't even true, and he'll strengthen and deepen our relationship with him. And so each and every week of this series, we're going to be talking about a document, or some weeks collections of documents from a very high level perspective. So we'll talk about background and history and context, talk about some major themes. Hey, let's pay attention when we read this. But the real kind of work of this series, the real kind of benefit of the series is when you and I actually read through these writings for ourselves during the week. And I think maybe just a little word picture, I think of these sorts of services or these videos that you watch online are like being handed a trail guide, and then during the week, we walk the trail. Now, whether you do that alone, maybe you're going to read it with your family together. I think we're going to try that. Your small group, whatever it is, actually reading through these documents. And I want to encourage each and every one of us, especially as we get this thing kicked off, the goal of reading through the New Testament is not just more information. Now, there's probably going to be plenty of that along the way, but the goal is not to do word studies. The goal is not to underline every verse or search up every cross-reference. Like, those things are valuable. They have their place and their benefit. But the goal of the next 3 months is to get out of the weeds and see this big picture view for the purpose of transformation. The goal is to walk the trail, if we want to use that analogy. And sure, we can notice all the cool things along the way, but not get stuck studying a tree and not finish the rest of the trail, right? The goal is for you and I to know God better. The goal is to trust him more. The goal is that each and every one of us would understand his heart more and what he's invited us into. And I tell you what, our hope and our prayer as a church for all of us, me too, is that by reading through the entire New Testament over the next 90 days, that's just going to give God more opportunity to challenge us and speak to us and encourage us and correct us and comfort us and do all the things and maybe even completely reshape our lives in a new and better and more fulfilling direction. And so that is what New in 90 is. And today we're actually going to get things kicked off with the Gospel of Matthew. Now, if you've been around for a while, this is going to be a little bit outside the norm for us, but I think it's important to understand, and we're going to do this every week of this series, some background, some context, some more might feel kind of classroom sorts of stuff before we start reading. Now, Matthew is the first document found in the New Testament. It's not the first one written, but when you open it up, this is the first one. It's one of 4 writings called the Gospels. Now, gospel is just another word for good news. And so there are 4 different gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 different accounts of the good news regarding Jesus. I don't know who decided there's only 4 and the other 23 are not good news. Like, I think the whole New Testament could be a gospel, but whatever, that's my personal thing. The 4 gospels are kind of like biographies of Jesus, little snippets. They're not his whole life, but 4 biographies written by 4 different people. They all kind of have 4 different unique perspectives and emphasis on who Jesus was and what he did, but they all describe the same person and the same mission. And so Matthew is one account of the life of Jesus. And pretty much throughout church history, it's been universally accepted that the author of the Gospel of Matthew is indeed Matthew, or sometimes he's referred to as Levi. He's a tax collector who became a follower or a disciple of Jesus. Now, tax collectors were pretty much hated by everybody in the first century, okay? The Romans didn't really like them. They just used them for a purpose. The Jewish people hated them because they stole and were traitors. But there was one thing about tax collectors that was pretty good. They were good at keeping detailed records. To a tax collector, numbers mattered and accuracy mattered and documentation and details mattered. And Matthew would have spent his entire kind of professional life and career recording information and paying attention to the details. When we read the Gospel of Matthew for ourselves, this writing is not just some random dude jotting down some things that are a little foggy in his memory from a long time ago. His background, his experience, again, everything he kind of was, would have made him especially good at preserving the details about Jesus and what he said and what he taught and where he went and what he was all about. And I don't know if a lot of people watch the TV show The Chosen. If you've ever watched that show, maybe you've noticed the character that plays Matthew. He walks around and sometimes he's got a little notepad and he's jotting things down as events are unfolding. Now, there's nothing in the Bible to support that idea. That's just the creators kind of having some creative liberty. But also it's probably not completely out of line to imagine that something like that might have happened. For these 3 years that Matthew followed Jesus around, he could have been doing that. And if Jesus wanted someone to walk with him and go with him and see the things, who was good at preserving information, well, then a tax collector like Matthew would have been a really good choice for something like that. Now, most scholars believe that this document was written within just a few decades of Jesus' life and ministry in the time he was here on earth. This Matthew was probably written sometime in the mid-60s AD, likely before the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And that is a remarkable thing, that this was written so close. In fact, all of the documents that we're going to read through together this summer in the New Testament, the very last one to be written was about 95 AD. And so all of these things were written within roughly 60 years of Jesus being here on the earth. Now, to our kind of modern society and minds, that doesn't sound that impressive. But when you compare this to other ancient historical writings, it is astounding. It's not uncommon at all for most ancient writings and manuscripts to be completed hundreds of years after events took place, or hundreds of years after somebody lived and died. In fact, much of what we know about people like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, their kind of histories were written anywhere from 150 to 450 years after they died. Again, this puts it after the writings that we find in the New Testament, despite the fact that both of those people and so many others died before Jesus was even born. And so here's why I think that matters. If documents that have a span of what happened and when they were written, if there's centuries in between that, and historians call those valid, that these are reliable accounts, then surely ones written within only a few decades should be considered even more reliable, right? See, Matthew wasn't writing about some distant historical figure that nobody could remember anymore. He was writing about someone who people still talked about. There were people still alive when Matthew wrote his gospel who had heard Jesus teach firsthand, who had seen Jesus perform miracles firsthand. People that would have read this for the first time would have seen Jesus crucified. People claimed to see him rise from the dead 3 days later. Matthew was writing this account in a world where eyewitnesses still existed and where friends and enemies alike could have challenged. If he was making this up, if it was lies, he would have been called out on it. People could investigate the claims that he writes for themselves. And in fact, towards the end of this document, he invites them to, hey, the Roman soldiers were given this lie. Go look it up. Now, if you're a skeptic, if you're not sure about Christianity, does that mean that automatically everything he says is true on its own because it's written so soon? No, obviously not. But as we kick off reading through the New Testament together, as we look specifically at what Matthew wrote, what this means is we are not dealing with stories and writing that evolved over hundreds of years and Jesus became this legendary figure before somebody wrote it down. Matthew is giving us an accurate account of who Jesus was and what he did within living memory of people who knew Jesus, saw Jesus, seen what he did. And that matters because Christianity, what we're going to be reading about and learning, Christianity is rooted in real history. It's not made up. It's not legend. It's not exaggeration. It's real history. Now, as we get to reading through Matthew this week, it's important to understand what I believe he was trying to accomplish. More than anything else, he's writing to impact Jewish people. And so this gospel, along with the book of Hebrews, which we'll get to later on in the series, have a very distinctly Jewish tone to them. You can kind of tell as you read through it. And he's writing to people, Jewish first century people, who had grown up hearing the stories of people like Abraham and Moses and David, people who knew what we call the Old Testament, knew that well. He's writing to people who had been waiting for hundreds and hundreds of years for God to fulfill all the promises he'd been saying. These first century Jewish people were just waiting for a promised Messiah, a king who would come and deliver them, bring them everything that they'd been hoping for, everything that God had been saying all along. And by the time Jesus steps onto the scene, the Jewish people, like I said, had been waiting hundreds, thousands of years, generation after generation after generation, just hoping one day God is finally going to come through with what he said. He's going to make good on everything that he's promised us. And so Matthew's main point throughout his gospel is clear that the wait is over and the king is here. I think if I had to summarize Matthew in one short sentence, it would be this: the king is here. And from the very first line of his account, it's totally different than the other three gospels. When we look at Mark next week, Mark starts with action, just Jesus on the scene running. Luke, in his account, starts with background and some things leading up to the birth of Jesus. The Apostle John starts with theology and all those sorts of things. But Matthew, his account starts differently, and it's something that most of us, if we've ever tried to read the Bible before, probably skim, maybe even skip over completely. Genealogy. So-and-so begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, and there's 42 generations of that. In fact, I can pretty much guarantee if you're going to read through this week, when you get to those parts, you're going to be overwhelmed with some of the names. I mean, some of them sound normal. Other ones sound like you're having a seizure, you know? Now, the lineage, the genealogy, does not mean a whole lot to us modern Western Americans. But it wasn't written specifically to us, or at least not the intended kind of first audience. Matthew's goal is to reach a Jewish audience. And to them, genealogy was incredibly important. And so Matthew, when he starts writing all these things, so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so, what he's doing is he's proving his point. Before he shares a single action, a single teaching, a single miracle that Jesus did, a single place that Jesus went, Matthew is proving this already. He starts off with Abraham. Abraham was considered the father of the Jewish people, and he traces the lineage to King David. And King David was, Israel's greatest king, and traced it from David down to Jesus. And Matthew is letting his audience know that Jesus didn't just show up out of nowhere, but that as they trace that lineage, as they trace the genealogy, that he's connected to everything God had been doing throughout history. More than any other gospel writer, Matthew constantly pulls from the Old Testament and from Israel's history. And depending on which translation you read from, he uses the word fulfill or fulfilled anywhere from like a dozen to 16 times. And over again, Matthew will say things like, all of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message, and fulfilled what the Lord had spoken, and fulfilled what the prophets said, and fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. And like all of these things, Matthew writes about the virgin birth. It was fulfilled in Jesus. Born in Bethlehem, this prophecy fulfilled in Jesus. That he was called out of Egypt. Matthew jots that down because it's a fulfillment of what God had been saying. And he's not just throwing in random words and random details because some publisher was like, you got to get to a certain word count, Matthew. No, what he's doing is he is constantly trying to connect the dots for his readers. That Jesus was not just the newest hot flavor of the month rabbi in the first century. There were plenty of those. Jesus wasn't that. That Jesus was the fulfillment of everything God had been promising all along. And every time that Matthew writes that something happened to fulfill, or every time that he quotes an Old Testament passage, I picture it like if Matthew was there, he's like shaking his Jewish readers. Hey, remember what God said? Remember what God promised. Remember what you've been waiting for. It's fulfilled. It's done. It's here. The King is here. Even the language that Matthew uses in his writing is intended to impact a Jewish audience. One of the more common phrases that is unique to his gospel is the phrase, the kingdom of heaven. Now, in all the other three gospels, it's written as the kingdom of God, or that's how it's translated to English anyway. Functionally, they mean the same thing. But the terminology kingdom of heaven in that ancient language was uniquely Jewish. Why? Because he's trying to reach Jewish people with the account of Jesus' life and ministry and what he's done. And as we read through this document this week, I hope we start to pick up on this a little bit. Again, not to get sidetracked, not to count how many times, but to notice it. Because everything in Matthew is connected to this main point. When Matthew writes about the birth of Jesus, he makes note, him alone, of the Magi who came and asked, where is this newborn King of the Jews? We've come to see him. When Jesus is riding into Jerusalem, the week before his crucifixion, Matthew quotes the prophet Isaiah that your king is coming to you. Even some of the last words that Jesus said in Matthew's records, Jesus says, hey, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Kingship. Nothing is random. Nothing is filler. He's building this case for who Jesus is. He's taking all of the history of the Jewish people, what they would have grown up with and studied and learned and known by heart, and he's showing how it was all pointing to Jesus, the Messiah, the King. And even though Matthew's gospel is not the first one to be written, it is a great way to start reading the New Testament, simply because it serves, I think anyways, kind of this bridge between the Old Testament and everything else we're going to read in the New. Because Matthew purposefully takes these promises and these prophecies and storylines and hopes and expectations that his Jewish audience would have been holding on to in the Old Testament and says, let me show you where all of this was heading. Let me show you the culmination of these things. The entire document of Matthew is pointing towards one conclusion. Jesus is the Messiah, he's the King, and he is here. And I think because of that, Matthew repeatedly writes about what it looks like to live under the rule of the King. to live in this new kingdom that Jesus was establishing. Because every kingdom has a culture. Every kingdom has values and priorities and things that they're focused on. And Jesus was constantly calling people to follow him, to become his disciple, and then showing them, here's what it looks like to be a part of my kingdom. Here's what it looks like to live out when I sit on the throne of your heart. Because the kingdom of heaven is the complete opposite of the kingdom of this world. And I think, anyway, it's my opinion, this is one of the main reasons why Matthew's gospel contains so much more of Jesus' teaching than any of the others. In fact, some people call Matthew the teaching gospel. There's so much practical information about what our lives should look like. Matthew records Jesus talking about how to pray and how to forgive and how to handle money and how to treat people. And hey, if you get into conflict, here's how you should fix it. And you know what? Here's how to serve other people. Matthew has these huge, large chunks of teaching from Jesus. Because if he really is the king, then people who believe that, people who claim to follow him as king, well, then our lives should look different than everyone else. And I would guess that as we read through things this week, there will be quite a number of things that are going to be challenging to us. Because I think it's far too common that we want the benefits of Jesus, but we're not so sure about the authority of Jesus. We want peace and hope and joy and comfort and blessings and all those things. And you know what? God provides those. But Matthew keeps highlighting Jesus' kingship. And not in detriment to the other. Jesus is the Savior who rescues us. And as we read through the rest of the New Testament, we will see that he saves us apart from anything else. Apart from our behaviors, apart from how well we follow his lead in every area of our lives. But make no mistake, he's also king, a king who is supposed to lead us as well. And in fact, Jesus says this, if any of you wants to be my follower, well then you know what? You must give up your own way, take up your cross and follow me. Jesus told people who were considering following him, I need to be more important than your possessions. And I need to be more important in your life than your positions. In fact, there's some they sound harsh, they're not, but where Jesus even says to some of his people, I need to be more important than your parents. In fact, he wouldn't let one guy who was considering following him, he said, don't go to your father's funeral. My mission is more important than that. We've only got a short amount of time. And Matthew is constantly highlighting the authority that Jesus has as king and continually including all the things that Jesus said that would reinforce that place of authority, that place of being of first importance in people's lives. The problem, though, is that Jesus wasn't the type of king that the Jewish people were expecting. At least not yet he wasn't. Now, when we wrap up this series and we read in Revelation, we get a totally different picture of Jesus as king. But in the first century, the Jewish people had an image in their mind of what this Messiah king was going to look like. They expected a political king, a military king. They were looking for a king that God would send who would overthrow those evil guys in Rome. You know, they kind of viewed that as the Washington, D.C. of their time. And restore Israel to this place of power and crush all their enemies and put them in their place. The Jewish people were expecting that a king would come with strength and victory and conquest and just blast everybody. But when Jesus shows up on the scene, the only thing he blasts is people's expectations out of the water. Because instead of gathering an army, he starts gathering fishermen. Instead of spending time with powerful and influential people, he spends his time with tax collectors and sinners and outcasts and people pushed to the fringes of society. Jesus never once talked about let's rally and let's defeat Rome together. Instead, he says this crazy stuff about loving your enemies. Instead of praising the religious leaders, the Pharisees, and some of the other groups that were there, you know what Jesus does? He calls them out and he blasts them, often to their face. One of the most frustrating things that Jesus did was continually shift everything from being focused on the external to being focused on the internal. The religious leaders of his day were so focused on outside appearances. Hey, did you follow the rules? Hey, did you keep the traditions? Did you wash your hands at the right time? Did you act righteous? Did you avoid some of those really bad looking sins? And Jesus just kept blowing by all that surface level stuff and going straight to the heart. In his Sermon on the Mount, which we will read the second day if you follow along with this plan, Jesus says these things that would have sent shockwaves through the crowd. We might be more familiar with them, so we don't hear them the same, but listen to what he says. Is you have heard that our ancestors were told, hey, you must not murder. If you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. Okay, everybody gets that. Sure, that makes sense. But I say, Jesus saying, hey, I'm the authority. I know you've heard the law, so I'm above that. I say, if you are even angry with someone, you're subject to judgment. Whew. Big difference between those two. He goes on, he says, you've heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say, okay, listen to me, I'm king. Anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Just keeps digging deeper and deeper. You've heard the law that says, love your neighbor. And then obviously everybody knew this, you hate your enemies, right? We come out with that one good. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you and who use you and who abuse you and who even, he's going to say later on, who are going to kill you. Over and over and over again, Jesus exposes all of these deeper issues beneath the surface. More than just behaviors, more than just appearances, more than just following the rules. As king, Jesus gets right to the heart. And sometimes, especially if it's maybe the first time you're going to read through Matthew, we can walk away thinking, boy, I really got to try hard. Man, I thought the rules were hard before, and now Jesus just keeps raising the bar. They're even more strict now. Whoa, this king is harsh. But Jesus isn't raising the bar because he thinks people need to jump higher. In all of these things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount and throughout his ministry, he's exposing how high the bar has been all along. In so much of what we're going to read this week, Jesus was making it abundantly clear to the Jewish people of his time, and in effect, even to us today, we can't be good enough on our own. That, hey, if we're trying to be right with God, if we're trying to get on his good side or something, we can't get there through our performance or our sincerity or our efforts. And all of the things that might seem like only rules. Yeah, this is how God wants us to live. But they also expose just how helpless we are on our own. The Jewish people in the first century, especially the religious leaders, all thought that they could earn a right standing with God through rule following. And Jesus just continually reveals how impossible, how almost foolish it is to assume that was the case. And I think God uses his word to communicate that same thing to us. There's no way we can be good enough. And so Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, keeps emphasizing this point over and over and over again. And I think it would be understandable to see Jesus' authority and his kingship and his rule. Again, especially if we're not familiar with reading, to see this and to feel this is like this intimidating thing at first glance. In fact, we might feel like several times this week to read about how differently we should live and just, almost be taken aback by that. But it is not meant to be oppressive or exhausting. In fact, Jesus' invitation to the Jews in the first century and to you and I is the complete opposite of that. And I love that Matthew alone, understanding his Jewish audience, includes this unique invitation that Jesus gave to people. His Jewish audience was used to pressure. They'd spent their entire lives living under a religious system that was heavy with laws and rules and expectations and traditions. And right in the middle of all these different things that Jesus was saying and enforcing and sounded harsh and heavy, things that maybe when they heard Jesus talk could have felt like, here's one more weight you got to carry. Matthew shares this incredible invitation from Jesus. He says this, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens." And Jesus says, "I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart. And you know what? You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give," you think it's a burden? Man, it's light. Jesus is not talking to people who are physically tired and weary and just need a long weekend and a good Sunday afternoon nap. Jesus is talking to people who were exhausted from carrying the weight of religion, who were weary from trying to be good enough, who were tired from constantly wondering, am I doing enough? He's talking to people that aren't really that much different from you and I, wondering, do I have what it takes? Am I doing enough? Can I follow the rules? Can I measure up to this, live in this new type of kingdom? Do I have what it takes to, abandon my own way and take up the cross that Jesus says? And maybe as you read through Matthew this week, that thought is going to pop up several times, like this seems like too much. But man, we got to remember this. Jesus is not saying try harder. His heart is not to give us another list or another burden or pile on the guilt. Instead, it's just this, come to me. Hey, if you will just come to me, you will discover that it is so much lighter and freer and more life-giving than you've ever imagined. Now, yes, there is a yoke, not an egg yolk. A yoke, it's like a farmer's thing. It was a big piece of wood that would tie two farm animals together to move a direction and do the work. And Jesus is saying, yeah, there is a yoke. I want you to join with me. I want you to follow me. I want you to go where I'm going. I want you to live how I've called you to live. But it's not performance. It's not earning. It's not proving. It's receiving. Jesus is saying, come to me and walk with me. And I think it is one of the most important things for us to remember as we read through the Gospel of Matthew this week. Because Matthew's goal is not to present us with a king who comes to make our life harder. He's presenting us with a king who wants to be with us. A king who came to rescue us from the impossible burden of striving to try and save ourselves. And Jesus is a king who is worthy of following, absolutely. But not because he's harsh out of fear, but because he's so good. And as we experience the love of God in our hearts, want to follow him. We follow Jesus as king, not because he's demanding, but because he is humble and gentle at heart. The king is here. And according to what Matthew writes, the invitation from Jesus is come to me. That's what he told the first century Jews. And here's the good news. It's the same invitation for you and I. Come to me. And so as we spend this next week reading through Matthew, I want to encourage us to keep a few things in mind. The first one being, if you are at all familiar with reading the Bible, to try and pay attention to how often Matthew points backwards. Watch and look for Old Testament references and fulfillment language and all the moments where where Matthew is connecting Jesus to the promises and prophecies that came before him. Again, don't get lost there, don't get stuck there, but let's notice it. Because every time he does, Matthew's point is the same, he's making the same argument. The king is here. The second thing I would encourage us to do as we read this week is to pay attention to the things Jesus says. I would say especially the things that make us uncomfortable. My guess is, as we read, some of his teachings and some of his words are going to make us uncomfortable. It's going to expose and come up against areas of our lives that we've been avoiding. And I want to challenge you, don't rush by those. Don't skim those parts. Don't just read it and then not think about it. Let's let Jesus be the king that he's meant to be. Let's allow God to challenge our thinking and reshape our priorities and speak to those parts in us where we still want to sit on the throne of our lives. Hey, I got plenty of those, don't we all? But I would say most importantly, because of the way Matthew writes in his intended audience, let's not lose sight of Jesus' heart as we read. Matthew's goal is to present the king, but not a king who's trying to crush us, a king who's trying to free us. And so let's not only read Matthew for information this week, but let's read through this looking for a better picture of Jesus. As we read each of the next 5 days to ask ourselves, hey, what does this writing show me about the king? What would it look like for me to follow the king more closely? And most important of all, how can I know this king? This king who wants to be with me. How can I know him better than ever before? Let's connect with God for just a moment before we head out. Father, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you for giving us this unique account of the life of Jesus that we call Matthew. Thank you for preserving this information. And I ask you, God, through the work of the Holy Spirit, as we read Matthew this week, that you would speak to us, that you would reveal your heart and your character to us more than we've ever known before, that you would have the freedom. God, we give you the freedom to challenge us, to correct us, to highlight areas in our lives that you want to transform. And I pray, God, that you would draw us closer to you. That invitation where Jesus says, come to me, help us do that this week. Not just read because we're supposed to read, not just read to get through the days, but help us read in a way where you draw us closer and closer in our relationship with you. We thank you in advance for what you're going to do as we dive into your word this week. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.